That quieted you down. Very good. Our speaker, the flight came in a little bit late, but our speaker is in Kent, getting ready to park now, and so just sit tight. We'll be with you real soon. Thanks.
there's an introduction, or do I just go?
I'm sure I'll introduce you, yeah. So if you want to
Just take a seat.
down and
Okay.
They haven't been going though.
All right, hello. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your patience. Our lecturer's flight was delayed, so we just raced here from the airport. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our lecturer, John Lott. John is director of the Master of Architecture program at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He's also principal of the firm Para Project and co-founder of Collective LOK, which is a collaboration with architects William O'Brien Jr. and Michael Kubo. John's a registered architect in California, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. He has been a Leopold Schepp and John E. Thayer Scholar and a project editor for the journal Praxis. He lectures widely and has served as an invited critic in many leading architecture schools. He has twice, I didn't even know this was legal, twice been named a MoMA PS1 Young Architects finalist, and he has won design competitions and received numerous design awards, including the Design Vanguard Award from Architectural Record, New Practices New York Award from AIA New York, Emerging Voices and Architectural League Prize from the Architectural League of New York, and most recently, a PA Award, that's Progressive Architecture Award, from Architect Magazine for his Pioneer Town House, which I think we'll see more of tonight. John received his B.Arch degree from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and his M.Arch degree from Harvard. Upon graduating from the GSD, he was invited by Rem Koolhaas to join OMA's New York office, where he worked for 2 years before joining Rex. I got to know John about 10 years ago when he joined the faculty at Syracuse University. There he directed the School of Architecture's New York City program and completed the design of several award-winning projects on and off campus in the city of Syracuse. He also has several projects located in New York and California. I often take my LA travel seminar students, for example, to the flagship store that he designed for fashion designer Philip Lim in West Hollywood. In that project, his paradoxical assemblage of materials, this includes pillowy concrete and sharp foam, are subtly provocative, recalling canonical projects like the Palazzo Diamanti in Ferrara, Italy. This, I think, is John's most interesting and important contemporary contribution. He's obviously a talented designer, an incisive critic, also an architectural provocateur in the best possible sense. His design experiments serve as more than merely audacious disciplinary transgressions. They also stand as nuanced adjustments to convention, and they're deeply informed by his respect for architectural history and his hopeful expectations for architecture's future. Please join me in welcoming John Lott.
Thank you, John. It's really great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. You're lucky to have Professor Yoder with you, in my humble opinion. So I want to start, and I think I agreed to this title, House on House, but really there's something a little bit less clear about that in a way. More like house on house action, kind of, or more like things and stuff in a way. This is, I'm going to go through 10 projects pretty quickly, and I'll watch time. Somebody can tell me if I'm going on long. But this is an architectural bust I was asked to join a show in LA. 11 architects were asked to make a bust like a sculptor typically would, but in architectural terms. And I struggled with this because it kind of gets to the core of what I'm interested in within the discipline, which is a criticism of the kind of architecture that produces objects, first and foremost, and have always been looking for an architecture that cares less about the face and more about the space. And so I made a bust that was a space for the face. And as you enter, this is Florian's face in my space. He had a bust in the show too, and it basically is just a viewing apparatus that you are curious about because of its form, and when you insert yourself in it, there is a reflective surface at the back that puts you where you just came from in a way. And so there is a kind of nothingness there, or in terms of an object, but a reassertion of yourself in a context, and through surfaces. And so this framing of space is always in relationship to its context is really what I mean by house on house. We'll get to that in a minute. One of the early projects that I did, this was just out of school, really at grad school, was a submission for this publication called 306090 that was run by Jonathan Solomon, who's now I think in Chicago, and Emily Abruzzo, who I believe now teaches at Yale. And it was on the topic of decoration. And so I went to Mies and asked, well, what if Mies were to receive a facelift? How might we address decoration and ornamentation in terms of the way we manipulate the face of a building, really, in this case Seagram's building, such that it is a critical look at architecture because we can. So we can make ourselves look younger through surgical procedures, and as architects we can manipulate through current technology, form and even structure fairly seamlessly. And we have, I think, moved from a kind of Fordist mentality of production to a post-Fordist kind of mentality, but in a way too quick or too soon. There was a period when I was leaving grad school where I felt like the manipulation, because we had the technology, had reached an absurd level, a kind of point of excess, and actually produced a series of slick and often useless architectures for the sake of producing architecture because now we can. We can make this, so we should. And I was very critical that there wasn't enough reliance on type and history, and that we rushed in a way to this kind of incredibly excessive form making. This is Fatboy Slim's song in Moulin Rouge, Because We Can. And became more interested in a kind of more deliberate surgical procedure, but also this slide is interesting for me because the idea of the mask over the face it does not reveal the image, right? But it is a kind of alluring apparatus that allows you to imagine the thing or often the space behind. And one last setup before we get into some of the projects, always interested in how the intervention is set relative to a certain kind of historical, in this case, painted or drawn context. So, the first house, in this case, in a house, was a project in Syracuse. John mentioned I had a few projects built in Syracuse for an attic of a Dutch colonial clapboard. This thing was done in the 20s or something like that, and I was asked to help redo the attic. And so I liked this project because it was primarily an interior. So I'm not dealing with the image of the project, if you will, but much more about a void within a more complex void of this house. And so this is the attic as I've manipulated it. You see a kind of stairwell here that rises up, and it's just split into two halves for writing space for this client. This is the solid study. And here you see the kind of program where it's incredibly low, so basically you can only walk down the center of this thing from sort of here to here. Do we have a laser pointer? And otherwise, there is a kind of seated program, a bathtub, a day bed, a desk, a kind of study chair in these nooks. And then storage where it gets far too small. So some early studies about how this house, if you will, within this house could situate itself relative to those voids. And again, some early studies, you see the stair here. The existing stair of the house came midway, so it made circulation because it's tight in the middle, very difficult. So we pushed that stair back down, made it steeper, turned it down to the second level like this, so that there could be a clearing out of that axial primary circulation spine with, as you can see here, very simple seated program, low program along the perimeter. At the rear of the space, there is a bookcase, but it has another experiment that rears its head again, some other projects, which has a lot to do with the orientation that one finds themselves in relative to the intervention of the architect, the current intervention. So here you see, it's very clumsy, I understand, but a kind of mirrored bookends. Let me get to this other image. Sorry, I'm going to go here. So zooming in, there are these kind of mirrored bookends that work evenly within the actual books. And there are also openings. You see here a kind of window. And so there is a deliberate confusion of what the surface is made up of, what is behind you, and what is beyond. And there are a few other attempts at this, but I became very interested in how your understanding of your orientation in a space and relative to the intervention could be playful in that regard. So sorry to go back. At the back of the space, there was an attempt to have a kind of a vertical expansion. These were the early studies of the skylights that were more holistic in their frame. But for budget reasons and also for some of the geometry reasons in plan was cut back only to allow for a clearing at the head. The other curiosity that plays through all of these is all these projects is what I might call a doubling or a coupling. Either coupling through reflectivity literally, as you see here in the glass, or kinds of coupling of geometry that allow two things, again, house original, if you will, and house new to be in tension in some form. The same time I was getting started as a practitioner, there was a friend of mine who is a songwriter. I always hate when people talk over text, but I'm going to try that here with you. That captured some of the angst that I felt regarding these types of architectures that were, in my opinion, increasingly useless and much more produced for the image. And this is going to get John going, I hope. And maybe less so, again, a regard for what he calls the primitive and the naive and the old, and a need to rely on those kind of histories and the baggage of architecture, right? Those types that we study, and how those should be distorted, not relied on directly, given current culture. But those things are there for us, and I think the generation before me, in my opinion, maybe ignored those things a little too much. So right, it's under their noses, it's right there. And so the next project I want to show with you is also in Syracuse, and this is a Latino cultural group that came to the university and wanted a space for their kind of events, specifically for their group and their organization. And their ask was that we look at these casitas that was a phenomena in the Bronx, where these tiny houses were built for the locals in the Bronx because of a series of fires. They built these on their own, these somewhat modest and very simple structures, so that they could gather as a community. And these casitas were what they were asking for, but the space that Syracuse gave them was inside of an empty warehouse. So it was very interesting for me as an architect because I felt liberated in a way to not deal with the exterior demands of the house, but I could treat the typology of the common balloon frame house without those demands and without those concerns, and consider a kind of porous logic of the frame rather than one of the image, right? The icon of the house, this is what we want because that's what we know, or something like that. And at the same time, what is used to make that image, if we just pull back, could produce something kind of interesting in and of itself. So the image of house was freed in some form of its surfaces, and a frame was produced that was distorted to fit within the given site. So there was this elongated, stretched, and kind of like taffy, pulled, and flattened at its ends. Really, the apex sort of only exists here, the kind of gable frame. But this very simple 2x4 structure ran from end to end to connect flexible spaces and fixed spaces, essentially. And so here it is built as this kind of interior house within a warehouse, all abusing the frame as a porous logic, but a very familiar kind of technique. And so there is a familiarity and a foreignness, I hope, to this house within a house. From one end to the next, there is a continuity through the repetition and the form. At the same time, through simple curtains, it can be closed somewhat to segment these respective events. Classroom, as you see on the left in the image, gallery at the back, a little library, kitchen, etc. Another house, in this case for a house, was this clients that owned the white one, right? Two writers. And they wanted a library and a writing room to do their work. And when I saw this context, I was reminded of this project. It was a project by Johnny Petna. He was a professor of mine, actually, when I was an undergrad, and I studied in Italy. I understand you have a broad program also in Florence. So I did the same thing. Cal Poly had one. And one of my professors was Johnny Petna, another was Cristiano Toraldo Francio of Super Studio. So these guys were like 70s radicals. And this is one of Johnny's projects, and I always thought it was kind of cool. It was pretty badass in a way, right? It's just a block of ice in the suburban context. And I think he's challenging the type. Right, this is my reading and interpretation of the project. I think for Johnny it was about the material and whatever, something slightly different. But for me, it's about this kind of strange repetition of the suburbs and this moment where you actually pause because you're looking at a blank placeholder, and I think there is a point then of reflection about the context. So that's what I was interested in, and that's what I tried to do. So this is the project built, and it's not ice. But it tries to accomplish some of that blankness and challenge of the typology of the suburban house. And so this is their house, and there's a tiny, very dark, deliberately bridge that connects to this writing studio. And it's actually a 3-volume structure that's added to the house. The lower is a garage and some storage. And the second, this is the section, the second level is a library. He said literally we have a ton of books, and he knows that it's accurately a ton of books because he had to move it across country, and that's what it literally weighed. So anyway, there's a ton of books. a ton of books in the middle, and then the room above is a bowl-shaped room for reading, and it's naturally lit on either end, kind of indirectly mostly, in a kind of soft room you'll see. So you can kind of lounge up there. It's essentially a giant bed. Going back one slide, the exterior on the south is a very dumb face, dumb literally, and has an attempt at a kind of Venn-like confusion of what the face is, and suggesting ambiguous space on the interior, right? And so, if you know Melnikov's studio in Russia, somewhere outside of Moscow, I think, I was also fascinated with this project as a precedent. But he does this in plan. He has these kind of Venn-like circles, and I try it in section, less clear, I think. So there are these kind of openings that work on the garage and the reading room and the writing area, but all seem to, on the exterior, be independent of those volumes. So here you see those voids working again in the bookcase, and I have a video here, and it never works, but essentially there, and you'll see some images, there are some reflective moments again. So this is a slightly, I think, better version of that experiment, where there are mirrored bookends and voids with the content of the wall to even better, I think here, confuse your orientation about inside and outside. There's the section, some early study models of the third floor, which is this kind of soft space. This is the third floor built, a deliberate break in the stair to get there, and this kind of felt, like deep felt floor for lounging and reading. This is like looking back through this gap as you rise through the stair, you see the tub that is at the end of the back of the library here. So the library on one side, and there you see the kind of pixelated reflection of this exterior, and as you move along, it actually kind of flickers in a way. Again, confusing orientation. Some tub studies. Entering from the house to the other house, and here you see just the kind of drawn relationships. And at night, the skin of the house is a very thin, like 3 millimeter fiberglass. It's like a silicone impregnated fiberglass sheet that's wrapped really tight in tension. And that's what allows for this kind of glowing skin, right? That those just cover typical glass, silicone glass, and there's only 2 moments where you can actually see out here and here. Otherwise, it's just letting a lot of good light in the room. And that same material is used, here. On the inside, it's really the only moment where there's a flexibility of that surface for obvious reasons, privacy. And so here's what it looks like at the back. And the bottom can open up as a breezeway to connect the rear and the front yards. I was very interested in this coupling talked about relative to the context in subtle ways, and so the canopy of the tree and the section work together to create a paired volume, and in the snow. And so it operates for me as a stranger in the mix, as a kind of misfit in the sequence, and a kind of gap within the type of the suburban house. I think one more in Syracuse, and then we'll move to some other stuff. This project was for the University of Syracuse, and the School of Education owns this, what used to be a hospital, at the edge of campus. So there's the kind of center of Syracuse University, sort of here, and as you go down what they call, I think, University Ave, if I remember correctly, this right here is really the edge where the commercial starts to happen. It's a little mix as you go down, but there is a pretty clear break in what is the university campus core and the kind of city and commercial aspects of Syracuse. And so the building, Huntington Hall, sits right here. what used to be a hospital, there was a competition held for this piece here, which was to give this building, which in the 70s turned its back to the city they argued at the time for safety reasons, and put a big fence around what used to be the front door to the building here, and to some ways protect it, and created a very backdoor entry here. But those kinds of social scenarios didn't really play out so much anymore, and you know, in the recent 10 years. And so the dean wanted to reopen and make a statement about where the building is located, its face, and create an event space and an auditorium. So my proposal was to put a hole in the building and a ramp up to its face. So here you see the original, and for many reasons, for accessibility, but also I think for me, a kind of long connection back to this important corner, produced a hole in the building, so it was like no architecture. But again, this is one of those where I was interested in producing the void of a house within an existing historic house. I was thinking of people like Sugimoto, who created the allure of the void within a historic frame and scene. Or Rauschenberg's A Race to Kooning, which you understand in a way, even though there's nothing there, that the history of the thing is still present, right? Because there was a painting. And so I was very interested in creating this void within a framed historic object, and creating this kind of removal of architecture just enough to make it very clear where the entry and the kind of collective gathering space. And so this was a very, in a way, simple project, though not easy, because you're removing masonry, 5 stories of buried masonry structure. But I think the impact is such that this void on the face makes a very clear relationship back to the university's axis, and very clear where the entry to the school is. Okay. How we doing? How we doing in the back? Everyone good? Does anyone know where this is? Just trying to get a drink of water. This is in New York City, and it's the Van Alen Institute. The Van Alen Institute is an organization that's pretty old. I think it's almost 120 years old or something. That's mission is to make the public more aware of what architects can do and designers can do for their cities, for their environments, etc. They own this building on, I think, 22nd Street. And they've historically been on the 6th floor or the 4th floor, occupying one of the spaces and leasing out the others. Well, the new director, David Vandeleer, was very smart in saying that if our mission is to be a public, to announce to the public what we do and to expose to the public what we care about, why aren't we on the street, right? The most public part of the building. And so he set up a competition, international competition that we won. And to be on the ground. And so there used to be a bookstore actually designed by Lott, which was great, but David wanted it to be bigger and to host events and also their offices. And so the references for this project are many. I'll mention a few. Does anyone know this Nishi project called Discovering Columbus? Actually, it's very apropos because today is Columbus Day, right? Yeah. Or Indigenous People Day, I think. And I think Nishi does too. If you take a close look at what he's doing here, this statue of Columbus in the middle of New York City, like super high up in the air, in a way inaccessible, unavailable to the public, and setting itself in a kind of, in terms, I think, at a distance. We started to consider the institution as always having a distance from the public because it has certain ideals, it has certain barriers. And so we liked this idea very much that David wanted to be on the ground, but we wanted even more to push that idea that when you walk by the Van Alen, you would feel included in it, so you didn't have to actually enter. And so we tried this, and that's why we were so fascinated by this project, because Nishi takes Columbus as an object, and he builds a scaffold up to it, and it builds a room around it, and mimics a kind of living room environment that you can go up to and see, to sit right there in your living room chair, your lazy boy, and see the Columbus statue, right? So there's something very interesting about just the repositioning of the space, or what I call the house, relative to an original, to reposition those relationships. And so we tried to do this, and I know it's a stretch, probably, at the Van Alen. The other reference for us was, apparently you can opt out of Google Street View if you really want to. And they do this a lot in Germany. And it's interesting because it's like, well, what are you hiding, right? Why are you so special or whatever? Like, I don't know, there's something to me very captivating about just this kind of blot on the urban public realm. And for me, there's a curiosity that develops. And so what we tried to do at the Van Alen, now try to stay with me here, is to bracket the space of the small interior sliver of a space in Manhattan by producing a screen on the exterior here, and this is the interior of that space, and a screen at the back that is quasi-reflective, that when you walk through this part on the street, the space continues on both sides, and you actually, for a second, have a feeling that you're included in the institution. Okay, so that's as far as we could get given and there are a bunch of other screens in play here, but basically we're playing with screens, obviously to serve their needs, but really to try to make the space seemingly available to those who are not part. So the plan actually is quite similar to the La Casita project for two reasons. One, circumstantial, that there needs to be a bunch of fixed, irregular parts to get a flexible program. But the other reason really is that the form creates a continuity from beginning to end, at the same time subtly segmenting entry and let's say a useful quasi-private back. And so it's tuned very carefully to do both, or to try to do both, to not shut off the depths of the space, right? And so the space built and empty is like this, and we got really far with the ceiling and the vinyl screens that you see and this kind of display wall, and that can close and open to connect the fixed and flexible program. And there is a reflective screen in the back, but to be completely blunt, unfortunately, let me go forward because this is one thing. This screen that we wanted in the front never happened, right? And in a way, it's interesting as architects, you propose, you pitch something, and then you understand certain parts can be realized and some can't. And I still lament the fact that this wasn't a part of the completed project. For me, it feels like it's necessary for it to work well. A lot of the other aspects of the project work, like its flexibility. That's what these slides are about, where we produced a calendar for the Van Alen. They can move the screens, open, close, to meet their needs, right? That they can host a big dinner party in the space by opening everything, or they can close things down and segment the space and have and use this display wall to discuss exhibition content. And so these were the kind of scenarios that we won the competition with. But what I still feel like, unfortunately, never got realized is that that piece that makes the public feel like they're in the space. And this thing was meant to be, it's part of the DOT initiative in New York. It's a bigger story that I won't go into, where they're creating in certain areas street seats, small extensions of the sidewalk, the public realm, that take up a parking space in the city, but are essentially extension of the sidewalk. And so this was meant to be a trailer for the Van Allen that could then leave the institution and produce pop-up events in the city. And so there was this kind of dual role about its mini house as a part of the house of the institution. But I got to do another version of that at Storefront a little later. In this case, literally shut down Storefront temporarily. There's another thing, a little phenomena in New York City, if you know. Any of you from New York or been to New York a little bit? Sometimes, once, twice? Anyone been to New York? What you often see in New York where there's a construction site or one of these green construction fences, they're mandatory part of a construction site for the safety. Right, and they're also highly regulated. They must be this specific green. They must be a certain height. They must have these openings, etc. And so, I decided it would be interesting to. This is an exhibition design that I did for Storefront. To shut down Storefront using one of these, claiming that Storefront was under construction. Sort of, it was a little bit for the exhibition. And that by doing so, we could actually double the space of the gallery on the street, because these things have to set off of the street wall by a certain minimum dimension, actually, so that the workers can be safe as well. And so, here it is, close. And so these openings also are mandatory. And behind this wall, which was to be dismantled over the time of the exhibition, so there was a little bit of taking advantage of a certain situation. But it was a short-lived thing, so we didn't get in any trouble. But these openings that are regular, it's not built in a super normal fashion behind. Actually, it's built with studs, but each stud has a reflective surface on its long side, such that when you look through the viewfinders, they actually flip your understanding of what's, again, beyond and what's behind and what's beyond. And so what you see there, this surface here, is a 2x4 with mirror on it. And it's just showing you what's further back on the storefront facade. And so it's playing with the idea of the viewfinder. Here's another, looking through the green painted plywood. There's another. And with the storefront facade, which is this, if you know it, this kind of operable, strangely operable series of doors that Stephen and Vito did. So here you see storefront in plan, which is, as we know, this kind of wedge shape with these amazing doors. This is my project here, which is this super dumb construction fence that has some tricks up its sleeve. But it's meant to, not quite, but double the space of the gallery. And so there's content on the back of this wall. There are these great photos by Naho Kabuto, who documented this, these construction fences all over the city and the terrible things that are being built in the city right now. Anyway, so basically it allowed one to pause and wonder what's happening at Storefront, good for the institution. It also doubled their exhibition space, which was good for them. So people could come in being curious and learn about these things. So this fence, here you see in an axon, had its a kind of short life as a solid object and quickly was dismantled. This is actually not showing it, but you can see the mirrors a little bit here as this kind of reflective screen, some of the content both on this wall and in storefront. So this is the space that we added, right, to the gallery. Or here where you see some of Naho's beautiful images and this kind of, it's hard to see because the mirror is so good at also showing the plywood that this feels like a blurry kind of wood surface now. But what happens when you take the the green ply off and leave the mirror in place is this flickering of the context and the institution. And as you walk on the outside, the institutional surface merges with the realm you're in and vice versa. And so there is this kind of, there's also a video, and I'm not good with videos, so I'll have to show you another time, of moving along this thing and seeing the institutional surfaces rapidly change relative to where you are. So there you see the doubling of the gallery in the urban context. So this is where I got a little bit more interested in strange couples, I think is a good way to put it. And was presented with an opportunity to do a house for an art collector, and how are we doing on time? In Florida. We're supposed to be done at 6:30-ish? Does that seem fair? Okay. So he has this house. It's pretty normal in a way, and he has a lot of art, and he needs more space. But he wants to live in the house while he adds to the house, and that's difficult. And the house is not that good. It's pretty bad. So I decided, great, you don't want to touch the house while you're living in it? Fine. We're going to build a screen around the house. We're going to get outside of the eaves, this terrible eaves, and we're going to create some structural points here, 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 these black dots you see. And above that, this is the roof of the house, right? Does that make sense? So the plan and then the roof, and you see some of these points extending beyond the eave of the house. And those are primarily a screen to cover the ugly, right? And then there are these structural points that allow a new box volume to be added above through giant trusses. And he has a nice private gallery with a hole in it so he can look at a planted roof garden. Right. It didn't happen, but I liked it. I thought it was a good idea. Here it is in model form, a little screen, and the gallery box on top of the house. Axonometric, we got all kinds of drawings for you. Axon, just to sort of understand. And so this is the thing covered. There's a dumbing down of the original given this cap over, and it was set up in a way that you could enter the gallery independent from the house, or you could bind them in a way, but almost touch the house, not at all. It didn't happen. He moved, unfortunately, somewhere else. But it led to a series of, it led to this kind of heightened interest in playing with the original and the double and the couple, a house on house. That one literally a house on house. And so another one that didn't come to fruition that I want to show that got me to some of the more recent experiments was this gallery project in West Hollywood for Moran. They're a commercial art gallery. And they have this existing warehouse. But inside there is all of this kind of structure, and it's difficult to light work because of the shadows, and also difficult to place large sculptures. A lot of their artists are sculptors. And so I proposed a exoskeleton. So here you see the existing wood trusses that you see here. And I proposed that we put a new exoskeleton truss system on the outside with a new kind of very simple roof to help with shade and shadow and environmental stuff. And there was this kind of open air plenum idea, but that would allow us to cut the existing truss out of that original space so we could go from this to something like this. And that might not seem like such a big deal, but for someone who's selling art, you want the architecture to minimally have a role, and to also be as flexible as possible to how you light it and the kinds of works you can show. So the idea was fairly simple on the interior, but what it did on the exterior was produce the possibility for a room at the back. Very simple means. By playing with this idea of roof on roof, we were able to produce another exterior space for their benefit. And here you see the elevation and section of that room here for events and parties, but also more art and the plans, and then from the side. And so it's this little stranger on the top that plays with the couple of a certain type within, let's say, element, as Rem would say, of the architecture, the roof. Okay, I think 2 more projects. This is Pioneer Townhouse, and it's in California, in the desert near Joshua Tree, right? And this is beautiful Boulder property. This isn't the Boulder property, but what they have on the property is it's a 5-acre parcel, and they have a homestead. These homesteads were built in the desert because they were giving land cheap if you would build. And so there was this push to build the most modest, simple structure, these one-room homesteads, they called them, and they would basically give you the land. And so on the property is one of these homesteads. It's a simple 18-foot by 18-foot masonry box. And I became very interested in how Pioneer Town was this kind of fake. It was built as a stage set for actors. They would go out there and film. So all of the buildings in Pioneer Town are built to be fake. So I was interested in borrowing elements of the simple house, closets, pantries, stairs, and screens and everything, and that they would gather around this homestead in a very particular way that seemed ad hoc and potentially accidental, I suppose, but still create a kind of sequence of spaces that made a lot of sense relative to the original. So here you see the original homestead in plan. The doppelganger form is the bedroom. This kind of horseshoe shape is an exterior forecourt that you enter, a carport here, you enter the forecourt, and then this sort of small entry, moving to the kitchen, living, a series of sort of necessary utilitary spaces, bathroom, day bed, bookcase, etc. But the freeing aspects of the way they relate to each other and the homestead were very intentional relative to the kind of bouldering of the landscape in Joshua Tree and in Pioneer Town. So the roof is like this that combines them all. So you get incredible deep porches in some areas that are outdoor and some are indoor. There's an intentional ambiguity there. The homestead is meant to be excavated so that there is a deep, low basement room that the stair gets you down to with a small wine cellar there. Here you see the plan drawn. And the section, right, where we carve out some of the initial landscape for a cool, relaxing room. Here you see the forecourt. And this room is, in a way, an attempt to challenge what came first. The homestead feels very original, but the excavating out and the hollowing out of its foundation through kind of flexible material, but also entry, gives it its seeming instability when one might think the original is the most stable part of the project. Some initial early renderings about these kinds of symmetries, couplings of exterior. This is literally the kind of bouldering on the property, and highly abstracted architectural clusters that mimic those kinds of piles in a way, not so literally, intentionally, but these objects all work as a kind of bouldering-like organization. This is one of the rooms that is intentionally meant to feel very exterior. It also has, and I won't go into detail here, a studio component to it. and there you see it in the landscape. This alone, this is the first time I came to a site and I was like, maybe we shouldn't do anything here. It's so beautiful. But I'm an architect, so we have to try. It is very beautiful, but I'm very excited about this project, and we're in permits now and getting very close to breaking ground. The last thing I want to talk about is this small intervention at the Fine Arts Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. This building by Kevin Roche and John Dinkelud. Does anyone know it? Do you guys know it? No? It was built in the 60s as a gateway to the campus in a way. It houses this School of Architecture, I think still, as I understand it. These are the studio spaces in this amazing light-filled volume. But I was very critical of its, let's say, the institutional, it reeked institutional. It's this heavy, brutalist, intense structure, and and these are early images with bad photography, or photography of photography, which makes it bad. But it has this like highly idealized kind of maybe trying to glorify the institution of the academy, if you will. And I became very interested in these structural elements which lift the volume that's occupied above the public and the ground, and found a critical moment where there could be a coupling with the heavy institutional logics and let's say construction methods and materials. So here's this kind of giant long bar that separates on the lower end what is the entry to campus and the town of Amherst, essentially, to the heart of campus and the kind of world of the academy. And so these structural V's, these guys here that hold the thing up, located this one here and found an opportunity to have a small intervention. And you can see it here. And the coupling was an intentional pairing with the institutional efforts, and I tried to imagine how a familiar and domestic methods, if coupled, could allow the awareness of these disparities, but also an awareness of similarities, right, and a kind of defamiliarization, if you will, of the institutional, and in an attempt to, through scale and common materials, make it more palatable and familiar. So there is this partner to one of the V's, and it is a distorted scale to fit, right, 2x4 kind of construction that takes the common balloon frame and snaps it from 8 feet, which is about here, all the way to, depending on where you are, 20 plus to 24 feet high. And the door and everything is grabbed and sort of scaled to fit. The 2x4s are even coupled and sistered, as you'll see in a minute, to try to maintain the proportions of the familiar balloon frame. But there is an ambiguity deliberately about how it rests when you see it in certain ways, that this heavy concrete actually seems to somehow need the wood. And that there is an ambiguity of scale, hopefully to bring down the scale of the institution, but also to give some kind of pride, if you will, to the domestic. And here it is in plan, simple room, half domestic, half institutional, looking up with the ceiling and without, common versus unfamiliar. The axonometric, which tries to make explicit those two. And here is the sistered relationship, where we take the common, simple Doug fir 2x4 and just bundle it, right? So there is nothing slick. It's very low res, and it is an attempt to use familiarity in ways that make one more aware of the institutional aspirations. it also attempts to, in a very small way, throw off the axis of symmetry. I think that's it for me. Thanks guys.
Great, thanks a lot, John. We have a few minutes for questions. Who has some questions? I'll kick things off with a quick one myself. Your work is obviously part of a larger contemporary conversation with other firms interested in the quiet and the cool and so forth. I'm thinking So Ill, Johnston Mark Lee, even a little Jimenez Lie and so forth. Something I'd forgotten about your work is how many mirrored surfaces or strips and kind of ocular carvings there are. You seem to be really interested in kind of optical effects or ocular effects and the kind of effect of foreshortening and false perspective and so on and so forth. Could you talk a little about the way you've elevated opticality or ocularity in the kind of hierarchy that most architects tend to kind of work with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me anyway, this sort of use of literal reflection has some to do with vanity. At least understanding that to some degree that's present in all of us, but certainly in institutions. And so at the same time, when you're in a context, when you're in a space and you are suddenly made aware of yourself within that relative to others, and I think that's what literal reflectivity can do, then I think there is a heightened awareness. And so yes, there are these kinds of points of the optical play of seeing something that you just passed, but also it is very much about, even if you don't see yourself, the knowledge of that surface and what it means, I think gives one a little bit more heightened sense of occupying the space in general. I didn't show this, but there's another project in Times Square, which is a whole series of mirrors that are heart-shaped, whatever. Anyway, we were in that project, which is hard to talk about because I'm not showing it, because it was in Times Square and the intensity of an environment like that with all the lights and so many people, and there's no way you can outdo it. We decided that maybe the best way is to just throw it back at itself, and that if one moving through Times Square would see themselves collapsed with this context, there would be another. So maybe another time I'll show you, or go look it up or something. But it definitely attempted to play on those kinds of, let's say, insecurities and vanity relative to the spatial interventions that we encounter. And so I think it's a little different than an intense measured play of optics, and it's very much about just increasing awareness. Yeah.
Hi. What I think is really interesting about your work is that it brings up a lot of interesting conversations about interiority. And so I started thinking about Christy Baez's essay called Possible Volumes that she wrote, where she defines space as being elusive, limitless, but volume, on the other hand, has to be kind of authored, and it implies that it's a limited resource. But I see that you're kind of working with these ideas together as one. So I wanted to know what is the dialogue or the relationship that you kind of seek between space and volume?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. I love that. And I haven't read the essay, so I'll go look. But you're right, and I guess I agree with what I understand the definition is, that anytime you create a definition to a space, there is a kind of claimed volume, and in many ways I'm interested in that ambiguity to have those volumes either bleed which is not so much this kind of trope about interior-exterior fluidity, but in a way for me, and I think I talked about this, the sense of one's orientation relative to an interior volume, that actually more interested in not the modernist version of like this, where it's just like inside, outside, bleed together, which is great. I have no problems with that, but I am more personally interested in the ambiguity of that relationship, such that it's not so one-to-one or clear, but it is actually both defined and hinted at. And so we play with reflection a lot to achieve that, or just geometry to achieve a sense that the space you're occupying has some relatable, even if incredibly ambiguous, relationship to an unoccupiable place, right? Yeah.
I'm very interested in those work you have the illusion of the mirror, of reflection, and cause the curiosity of the interior and exterior, and also some of the masks you mentioned about also cause the imaginary of what's going to happen inside the mask and what's going to happen inside the blur. I'm just really interested in that part. Can you like talk about that more, about how you decided to which should be masked out and which to be showing to people like that way?
What should be masked and what should be shown?
Yeah, like for example, like you was having something like a screen wall and then having like blurred content, and also you was mentioned about like the first project of that bus, and you was talking about there was the people with the mask, and then caused the imagination of what's behind it, and actually they have like a whole series of phenomenology and a whole series of the physical theory to support that, but I'm really interested in that part.
Yeah, no, definitely play with that a lot, and I think in terms of what to screen and what not, I think it always depends on the project at hand. And so, for instance, you know, this small face of the Van Allen, this small storefront that they had on 22nd Street in Manhattan, for me to just cover that up instead of redesign its mullions or something like that, is far more interesting because it just raises it. So in that case, the storefront was a perfect thing to screen, right? The whole thing was so small, and it was anyway. It was a way to get a new. Also, I didn't talk about it's landmarked. There's always a synthetic reason for these things to use. It was a landmark facade, so you can't really do much to it. So it was a way to get a face and accomplish the ambiguity that a screen can, and the allure of a screen. So it's hard to answer like directly what to screen and what not. If I understand your question, it's always circumstantial. Yeah.
I'm currently working on an adaptive reuse project, and I noticed several of yours were adaptive reuse. Mm-hmm. I want to know how exactly you balanced like what to add and what to keep in terms of the original building, and how to balance out the familiarity of the original building, but also the additive aspect as well.
Mm. Yeah, well, for instance, did any specific project come to mind? Because, again, it sort of depends, right? So, for instance, in Huntington Hall, I wanted to do just enough to have a powerful impact as a void, and basically leave the recognition of the building intact, and respect some of those lines. You know, it wasn't, some might think it was aggressive, but it wasn't a kind of Gordon Matta Clark cut, right? It was a kind of very precise and respectful, I think, you know, some might disagree, cut. Yeah, so I think it depends, like what's the program being asked of you, and how important is the original to begin with. You know, I could argue that this little homestead in Pioneer Town isn't really that important. Like, maybe as a work of architecture, I don't know, some might find it somewhat, you know, trivial or something. But I think there was, so I think it's a judgment call, you know, that you as an architect can make, you know, what matters in this project. I don't think there's ever a right answer in that regard, right?
Okay, one more question.
Hey, I just wanted to ask a broad question about the sort of use of imagery in your work. Because I think there's an interesting pairing between like a slightly absurd proposition in terms of perhaps like planning. So like with the Pioneer Townhouse especially, but then that's coupled with like a very compelling and sort of like confident image of the space. And so like in a pragmatic level, like how do you use it as a tool for like arguing for these projects to different audiences? And also like, I'm just curious, you know, what the status of the image is in your office, like how that's kind of, like where it stands in terms of like you making decisions internally.
When you say image, do you mean the renderings? Do you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a practical aspect to communicating with the client through images. Fortunately, this client is savvy enough to also get invested in the plan, in the model, and in an abstract way as well. We are at a point now where we're doing like DD level stuff, so we really want to know how does it look and feel. So those are as useful to us as they might be communication tools with the client at that stage. But certainly when, you know, at the beginning, those kinds of images are either far more crude. You mentioned absurdity, and I think that I like this part of the discipline. I think a lot of what we do is necessarily absurd. A room like this is deliberately absurd. Pioneer Town is less so deliberately absurd. I think it's actually pretty earnest in a way.
Well, not absurd, but I just mean like it's less, like the planning is a little, it's not sort of the expected outcome of like, you know, standard house layout.
Right. That part is very deliberate, and so is like a play. And we actually, I'm sorry the videos aren't working. Those blank slides are videos. This is kind of animation, slow animation of how those characters arrive at their places in plan, and so it, in a way, is the first time treating the elements of architecture separate deliberately, and trying to. This has a lot to do. It's a little bit more meta than House on House. It's that each piece has its own autonomy, if you will, relative to the others, but they're coerced into position around this thing. So there is a kind of narrative that developed about imposing pressures on the elements that we define space with. And I think that by doing that and getting out of certain orders or regular means of organization, for instance, was very enlightening for us in the studio. It became very playful. And I think we arrived at something that we would never have arrived at if we were to kind of, you know, just like start with the 9 square or whatever, right? Which that project plays with a lot. So Hayduk's Texas 9 square houses. Anyway, so it's very aware of those kinds of earlier orders, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, thanks. Good question.
Okay, thanks so much. Join us for a light reception here. Hopefully have a chance to talk with John a little less formally over some coffee and punch. Also remember, tomorrow, same time, same place, Billy Cene's lecture will be right here. Thanks again, John, for a great lecture.
Yeah, thank you.